The sky suddenly darkened on that fall afternoon in 1985. It wasn't an ordinary storm approaching. It was something much more sinister. I was on my way home from my shift at the factory when I saw the first ships appearing among the clouds. Huge, metallic and silent, they loomed over our small town of Millbrook like predators stalking their prey. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I was one of the first witnesses to their arrival. The aliens who would change the fate of humanity forever. Sirens began to sound, echoing through the deserted streets. Panic spread quickly. People ran to their homes, locking doors and windows as if this could protect us from a threat from the stars. I was paralyzed, unable to look away from that terrifying spectacle in the sky. It was then that the broadcast began. All the TVs, radios, and even the city's loudspeakers squawked for a moment before a metallic, emotionless voice filled the air. People of Earth, we come in peace. We offer you a deal. Total submission in exchange for eternal harmony. Renounce your freedom and we will eliminate all wars, disease, and misery. Resist and you will be annihilated. You have 24 hours to decide. A deafening silence followed. The implications of that message were too devastating to process immediately. Slavery or extinction, what choice was that? I rushed home, my thoughts in turmoil. My wife, Sarah, was waiting for me at the door, tears streaming down her pale face. I hugged her tightly, as if I could protect her from the threat hanging over us. "What are we going to do, John?" she whispered, her voice laced with fear. I had no answer. How could I? In a matter of minutes, everything we knew had been turned upside down. Our lives, our dreams, our future, everything hung in the balance. The hours that followed were a blur of frantic news reports, conspiracy theories, and confusing official statements. The government seemed as unprepared as we were to deal with the situation. World leaders met in emergency sessions while the population waited in terror for a decision that would seal our fate. As night fell, the streets of Millbrook remained empty, except for the occasional military vehicle patrolling on high alert. The air was charged with tension, as if the atmosphere itself could explode at any moment. I couldn't sleep. I spent hours at the window, watching the alien ships that now blocked out the stars. Their lights pulsed softly, a constant reminder of the impossible choice that had been forced upon us. Zara joined me, her eyes reflecting the ethereal glow of the ships. "Do you think they can really put an end to all the suffering?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe," I replied, uncertain. "But at what cost? What kind of life would we have without freedom?" As we talked, I noticed movement in the streets. Small groups of people were beginning to gather, some carrying makeshift placards. From a distance, I could read some of the messages. "Welcome, space saviors, and peace at any price." My stomach churned. Were there already people willing to accept the aliens' offer? Was the desperation for a life without conflict that strong? The hours passed slowly, each minute bringing us closer to the deadline. The tension was palpable, like electricity in the air. At some point during the early hours of the morning, we heard the sound of breaking glass and distant screams. Chaos was beginning to set in. When the sun rose, bringing with it the last day of term, Millbrook was unrecognizable. Barricades had been erected on the main streets. Rival groups faced each other, some advocating surrender, others vowing to fight to the bitter end. The fragile social order we knew was shattering before our eyes. I knew we had to do something. Staying at home, passively awaiting our fate, was not an option. With a heavy heart, I turned to Sarah. "We need to find out what's really going on. These creatures, whatever they are, can't be trusted. There must be more to this story than they're telling us." Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and determination. "Where are we going?" I hesitated for a moment, considering our limited options. It was then that I remembered the old abandoned bunker on the outskirts of town, a remnant of the Cold War that everyone had forgotten about. "I know a place," I said, already gathering essential supplies in a backpack. "If anyone knows more about this invasion, that's where we'll find answers." As we prepared to leave, a dark thought occurred to me. What if there were no answers to be found? What if this really was our only choice? Submission or destruction? I shook my head, pushing these thoughts away. There had to be another way out. Humanity had faced countless challenges before. We've survived wars, pandemics, and natural disasters. Surely we would find a way to overcome this alien threat too. With one last look at our house, I grabbed Sarah's hand and we headed out into the chaotic streets of Millbrook. The sky was still darkened by the alien ships, a constant reminder of the danger we faced. But as we moved stealthily through the streets of our now unrecognizable hometown, I felt a spark of hope ignite in my chest. We didn't know what we would find in that abandoned bunker, but we had to try. The future of humanity could depend on the discoveries we made in the next few hours. And as we walked towards the unknown, I swore to myself that I would do everything in my power to save our world, our freedom, and our future. The clock was ticking. We had less than 12 hours to find an alternative before the alien ultimatum expired. The journey to the bunker would only be the beginning of our fight for humanity's survival. The road to the bunker was a journey through chaos. The once peaceful streets of Millbrook now teemed with a volatile mix of fear and despair. Groups of people were fighting each other, divided between those who saw the aliens as saviors and those who saw them as conquerors. The air was heavy with the acrid smell of smoke. Someone had set fire to the town hall, a burning symbol of an order that no longer existed. Sarah and I moved stealthily, avoiding the most tumultuous areas. Each step took us further away from the life we knew and deeper into an unrecognizable world. The alien ships continued to loom over us, their gigantic shadows a constant reminder of the impossible choice we faced. After what seemed like an eternity, we finally reached the city limits. The old bunker was hidden in a wooded area, almost swallowed up by vegetation after decades of neglect. We stopped for a moment, catching our breath and looking at the rusted entrance. "John, are you sure about this?" Sarah whispered, her voice betraying a mixture of fear and doubt. I nodded, although I wasn't as confident as I would have liked. "It's our best chance of finding out what's really going on." With a deafening creak, we forced open the heavy metal door. The air that escaped was cold and damp, laden with the smell of mold and long-forgotten secrets. We switched on our flashlights, the beams of light revealing a corridor that plunged deep into the earth. We descended slowly, our footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. The bunker was bigger than I had imagined, a labyrinth of rooms and corridors. We passed old dormitories, an abandoned kitchen and what looked like a communications room, full of obsolete equipment. Then we heard it, a low, almost imperceptible hum, coming from deeper in the complex. We exchanged an apprehensive glance before following the sound. It led us to a locked door, different from the others. This one seemed newer, out of place in this abandoned environment. "How do we open it?" Sarah asked, examining the electronic lock. Before I could answer, a soft click echoed down the corridor. The door opened slowly, revealing a room illuminated by dozens of monitors. And there, sitting in front of them, was a man I had never expected to see there. "Professor Hawkins!" I exclaimed, immediately recognizing my old high school physics teacher. The man turned around, his tired eyes widening at the sight of us. "John, what are you doing here?" I quickly explained our journey, our search for answers. Professor Hawkins listened intently, his face a mask of concern. "You were right to come," he finally said, gesturing for us to approach the monitors. "What we're facing is far worse than anyone realizes." On the screens, we saw satellite images showing alien ships all over the world. Graphs pulsed with incomprehensible data and lines of code ran incessantly. "They're not here to save us," the professor began, his voice deep. "The peace they offer is a lie. I've studied their transmissions, decoded their messages. They are parasites, John. They travel from planet to planet, offering this same deal. But the peace they bring is only the first step." My blood ran cold. First step to what? "Transformation," he replied, swiveling in his chair to stare at a series of disturbing images. "They alter the biology of the beings they conquer, turning them into something else." neither human nor alien. A race of perfect slaves, unable to resist or question. Sarah stifled a scream, her hands covering her mouth in horror. I felt my stomach flip, the reality of the situation finally crashing down on me with all its weight. But how do you know all this? How? My voice failed me, unable to fully process what I was seeing and hearing. The professor sighed heavily, running his hand through his gray hair. I'm part of a secret group, a global network of scientists and researchers. We've been monitoring signs of extraterrestrial life for decades. When they arrive, we activate emergency protocols. This bunker is one of our operations centers. He paused, his eyes fixed on a particular monitor. But we're not the only ones who know the truth. There's resistance forming. People in positions of power who understand what's really at stake. At that moment, one of the screens flashed on, showing a live broadcast. It was the President of the United States, his face a mask of determination. "My compatriots," he began, his voice echoing in the bunker room. "In the last 24 hours, our nation, our world, has faced the greatest threat in its history. We have been presented with an impossible choice by beings from another world, but I am here to say that we reject their terms. Humanity will not bend. We will not trade our freedom for false promises of peace." We watched, stunned, as the president outlined a global action plan. Military forces from all over the world were uniting, preparing for a coordinated counterattack. Scientists were working tirelessly to develop weapons capable of penetrating the alien defenses. "The time is now," the president concluded, his eyes shining with a mixture of fear and determination. "We will fight not only for our freedom, but for the very essence of what it means to be human." When the broadcast ended, a heavy silence fell over the room. Professor Hawkins turned to us, his face a mixture of hope and apprehension. "And now," he said softly, "the real battle begins." Sarah squeezed my hand, her eyes reflecting the fear I too felt. But there was something else there, a resolution, a spark of hope. "What can we do?" I asked, my voice firmer than I had expected. The professor smiled, a tired but determined smile. "Everything," he replied. "We need every mind, every pair of hands. The fight for Earth has only just begun." As the bunker buzzed with renewed activity, preparing for the role it would play in the global resistance, I knew that our lives had changed forever. The world outside was on the brink of chaos, divided between those who would accept the alien offer and those who would fight. But now we had a purpose, a mission. Humanity would face its greatest challenge, and we would be at the center of that storm. The clock kept ticking, but now it was no longer a countdown to surrender. It was a race against time to save everything we knew and loved. As the professor began to instruct us on our roles in the resistance, I couldn't help but wonder, would we be able to overcome this threat? Or would this be the twilight of humanity as we knew it? Only time would tell. And time, more than ever, was not on our side. The hours following the president's statement were a whirlwind of frenetic activity. The bunker, once silent and abandoned, now pulsed with life and purpose. Scientists and military personnel began to arrive, transforming the place into a makeshift command center for the resistance. Professor Hawkins put us to work immediately. Sarah, with her background in biology, was assigned to a team studying alien physiology, looking for possible weaknesses. I, with my engineering background, was tasked with helping to develop weapons capable of penetrating the defenses of the invading ships. Time seemed to flow differently underground. Days passed in a blur of calculations, experiments, and strategic planning. Outside, the world we knew was falling apart. We received constant reports of global conflicts as humanity was divided between those who resisted and those who accepted the alien offer. It was during a rare break that I overheard a conversation that chilled my blood. "The acceptors are gaining ground," said a military officer, his voice low and tense. "Entire cities are surrendering, believing the promises of eternal peace." "And what happens to them?" asked another, fear evident in his voice. There was a heavy pause before the answer. "Transformation. Just as Professor Hawkins predicted, they're no longer human. I swallowed, remembering the disturbing images we had seen in the first few days in the bunker. The reality of the situation was even more terrifying than we had imagined. It was at that moment that the alarm sounded. "Motion detection on the surface," shouted someone from the control room. "We've got company." Chaos ensued as everyone rushed to their positions. Sarah and I met in the corridor, exchanging looks of panic and determination. "They found us," she whispered, squeezing my hand. Before I could reply, Professor Hawkins appeared, his face a mask of urgency. "John, Sarah, come with me. Now!" We followed the professor through a maze of corridors I didn't even know existed, descending even deeper into the underground complex. The sound of explosions above us made the ground shake. "Where are we going?" I asked, panting. "To our last hope," replied the professor, without slowing down. We finally reached a huge circular room, dominated by a machine that looked like something out of a science fiction movie. Tubes and cables snaked across the floor, connecting to a pulsating central core of bluish energy. "What is that?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with amazement. The professor turned to us, his gaze intense. "This, my young people, is the result of decades of research into quantum physics and recovered alien technology. It is our secret weapon against the invaders." He moved quickly around the control panel, his fingers flying over the keyboards. "We discovered that the aliens use an advanced form of quantum communication to coordinate their ships and troops. This machine can interrupt that signal, potentially crippling the entire invading fleet." My mind spun with the implications. "But if they're here, that means—" "It means we only have one chance," the professor added, his voice grave. "If we fail, not only will this bunker fall, but we will lose our best hope of defeating the invaders." At that moment, a particularly loud explosion shook the room. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the lights flickered ominously. "We don't have much time," the professor said, motioning to a series of complex controls. "John, I need you to monitor the energy levels. Sarah, keep an eye on the quantum interference patterns. I'll start the sequence." We took up our positions, fear and adrenaline coursing through our veins. The machine began to hum, its energy increasing by the second. The air in the room became charged with static electricity, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "We're almost there," the professor shouted above the growing noise. "Just a few more seconds and—" A deafening explosion interrupted his words. The door to the room was ripped off its hinges, revealing tall, slender figures, their forms obscured by a strange, glowing mist. Aliens. They had found us. "Keep going!" the professor shouted, putting himself between us and the invaders. "Don't stop, no matter what!" What followed was a nightmare of light and sound. The professor was fighting the aliens with a strength I would never have imagined in a man of his age. Zara and I clung to the controls, desperate to complete the process. I watched in horror as one of the aliens grabbed the professor, lifting him off the ground. But even in that terrible moment, Hawkins maintained his determination. "Now, John," he shouted, his voice strangled, "activate the final sequence." With my heart in my throat, I pressed the button. The machine roared to life, a wave of blue energy expanding in all directions. The alien screamed, a high-pitched, non-human sound that pierced my eardrums. And then silence. When the light dissipated, the aliens had disappeared. The professor was lying on the ground, motionless. Sarah and I ran to him, fear gripping our hearts. But as we knelt beside him, he opened his eyes, a faint smile on his lips. "Did it work?" he asked, his voice just a whisper. Before we could answer, the sound of celebration echoed through the corridors of the bunker. In the control room, the screen showed the alien ships falling from the sky, their lights going out one by one. "Yes, Professor," I replied, tears of relief and exhaustion streaming down my face. "It worked. We won." But as we helped the professor to his feet, a grim realization came over me. We had won this battle, yes. But the war was far from over. Outside, a divided and devastated world awaited us. Millions had undergone the alien transformation. Cities were in ruins, governments had fallen, And we, the survivors of this first wave, would have to rebuild. We would have to find a way to reverse the effects of the transformation, to unite a fractured humanity. As we climbed back to the surface, the weight of this responsibility weighed heavily on my shoulders. The sky, for the first time in days, was free of alien ships. But the horizon was far from clear. Our fight for humanity's survival had only just begun, and I knew, looking at Sarah and the professor, that we would face whatever came our way together. The future was uncertain, full of unknown dangers, but also of hope. And that hope, however fragile, was all we had. It was all we needed. The sun rose over an unrecognizable world. As we emerged from the bunker, the reality of the devastation hit us full force. Millbrook, once a peaceful country town, was now a landscape of destruction and chaos. Crumbling buildings, deserted streets, and an oppressive silence that seemed to engulf everything. "My God," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "What have we done?" Professor Hawkins, still weak from the confrontation with the aliens, leaned on me. "We survived," he replied, his voice tired but firm. "Now the real work begins." In the weeks that followed, the extent of our triumph became painfully clear. Yes, the alien ships had fallen. Yes, the immediate invasion had been stopped. But the price was almost unbearable to contemplate. Reports were coming in from all over the world, each one more disturbing than the last. Entire cities had been turned into quarantine zones. Their inhabitants, those who had accepted the alien offer, now creatures that were neither human nor alien. The transformed, as they came to be called, wandered the streets in a state of confusion and agony. Their distorted bodies, a grotesque fusion of human flesh and alien technology, were a constant reminder of the horror that had almost befallen all of humanity. Our small bunker team soon found itself at the center of a global reconstruction and research effort. Professor Hawkins, recognized as one of the main architects of our victory, was summoned to lead an international task force dedicated to reversing the effects of the alien transformation. Sarah and I became his closest assistants, plunging headlong into a world of advanced science and questionable ethics. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, as we worked tirelessly to find a cure. It was during one of these long nights of research that we made our first significant discovery. "John, come and see this," Sarah called out, her voice a mixture of excitement and apprehension. I rushed to her side, looking at the microscope screen. What I saw took my breath away. The cells of a transformed, exposed to a new combination of compounds we had developed, were changing. Is it reverting?" I asked, hardly daring to believe it. Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with restrained tears. "Partially. It's not a complete cure yet, but it's a start." The news spread quickly, bringing a ray of hope to a world desperate for good news. But with hope also came a new wave of ethical and logistical challenges. "We don't have enough resources," Professor Hawkins explained during a tense meeting with world leaders. "To produce this cure on a large scale, we will need facilities, equipment, trained personnel, things that are scarce in a post-invasion world." The discussions that followed were heated. Who should receive the cure first? How to deal with those who, even if healed, would forever carry the physical and psychological scars of the transformation? And then came the hardest blow. "We've detected activity," a military officer announced, interrupting one of our planning sessions. "The fallen ships are emitting signals." The silence that followed was deafening. We all knew what that meant. The aliens hadn't been defeated, just temporarily incapacitated, and now they were regrouping. "How long do we have?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Weeks, maybe a month," was the grim reply. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. Everything we had fought for, all the progress we had made, was about to be swept away. I looked at Sarah, saw the same fear reflected in her eyes. But then Professor Hawkins stood up, his frail figure somehow emanating an unshakable strength. "No," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Let's not give up now. We have a partial cure, we have knowledge of the enemy's weaknesses, and, most importantly, we have something they will never understand: the human will to survive, to fight, to overcome. His words lit a spark in all of us. In a matter of hours, a new plan began to take shape, a bold strategy that combined our newfound cure with what we had learned about alien technology. "It's risky," admitted the professor, "but it's our best chance." As we prepared for this new phase of the battle, I couldn't help but reflect on how my life had changed. Just a few months ago, I was an ordinary worker in a small town. Now, I was at the center of a fight for the very survival of humanity. Sarah approached me, entwining her fingers in mine. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. I looked at her, at Professor Hawkins, at the whole team that had become my family in these dark times. "I'm thinking that no matter what happens, I'm grateful to be here, for having the chance to fight." She smiled, a tired but determined smile. "Together," she said. "Together," I repeated. Outside, the sky was darkening, foreshadowing the coming storm. But inside us, a light of hope burned, stronger than ever. The final battle was coming, and we were ready to face it, no matter the cost. Time, our most precious and scarce resource, was inexorably running out. Every second that passed brought us closer to the inevitable confrontation with the aliens, who, we now knew, were regrouping for a second attack. Our base of operations, once a hidden bunker, was now the epicenter of frenetic global activity. Scientists, military personnel, and leaders from all over the world were converging on this point, bringing with them humanity's last vestiges of hope. Professor Hawkins, despite his advanced age and the exhaustion evident in his eyes, was tirelessly leading our efforts. His bold and dangerous plan was our only chance of survival. "The partial cure we have developed," he explained during a tense strategy meeting, "is not just a way of reversing the transformation, it's a weapon." A murmur went through the room. Sarah and I exchanged worried glances. We knew where this would lead, and the moral weight of this decision was almost unbearable. "Aliens connect through a psychic network," continued the professor. "If we can introduce our cure into that network, we can not only free the transformed, but also incapacitate the entire alien fleet." "But Professor," I intervened, my voice betraying my anxiety, "to do that, we would need a volunteer," he added, his heavy gaze meeting mine. "Someone willing to undergo the transformation and then be cured, serving as a Trojan horse for our biological weapon." The silence that followed was deafening. The implication of what the professor was suggesting was clear to everyone. We would essentially be condemning someone to a fate potentially worse than death. It was Sarah who finally broke the silence. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "No!" I shouted, my heart freezing in my chest. "There must be another way." But deep down, I knew there wasn't. I looked around the room, seeing the same realization in the eyes of everyone present. This was the price of survival. The following weeks were a blur of frantic preparations and unspoken goodbyes. While teams from all over the world worked to refine our cure and turn it into a weapon, Sarah underwent a series of tests and procedures to prepare her for what was to come. I spent every free moment by her side, memorizing every detail of her face, the sound of her laugh, the touch of her hand on mine. The certainty that we might lose her hung over us like a dark cloud. "Don't you dare look at me like that," she scolded me softly one night as we watched the stars outside the bunker, "like it's the last time." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Sarah, She put a finger over my lips, silencing me. "I know. I love you too. And that's why I have to do this. For us. For everyone." On the eve of D-Day, as we came to call it, Professor Hawkins brought us together for one last meeting. His face was marked by fatigue and worry, but his eyes shone with a fierce determination. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice charged with emotion, "we will face the greatest challenge in human history. Not only will we fight for our survival, but for the very essence of what it means to be human." He paused, his gaze scanning every face in the room. "The sacrifice we ask is immense, the risk incalculable, but the alternative—" His voice faltered for a moment. "The alternative is extinction." As the professor detailed the final preparations, I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. Sarah, my love, my partner, was about to undergo unspeakable horror in the hope of saving us all. The final hours before the operation passed like a slow-motion nightmare. Sarah was taken to the laboratory, where she would be exposed to the alien transforming agent. I watched helplessly through an observation window, my heart breaking every second. "It started," announced one of the scientists, his voice tense. I watched in horror as Sarah's body began to twitch and change. Her skin took on a metallic sheen. Her eyes, those eyes I loved so much, became black, empty orbs. It was at that moment that the alarms went off. "Contact!" shouted someone from the control room. Multiple alien ships detected approaching the atmosphere. Chaos ensued. Orders were shouted, people ran to and fro. But I remained motionless, my eyes fixed on Sarah, now unrecognizable in her transformed form. Professor Hawkins appeared beside me, his hand on my shoulder. "It's time," he said softly. With a heavy heart, I nodded. It was time to administer the cure, to launch our last desperate move against the invaders. As the syringe approached Sarah's arm, I closed my eyes, a silent prayer on my lips. Outside, the sky was lighting up with the arrival of the alien ships. The final battle for Earth was about to begin, and everything depended on Sarah, her sacrifice, our desperate science, and the faint hope that, somehow, the human spirit could triumph over the cosmic terror that threatened to engulf us. Humanity's fate was sealed. It only remained to be seen whether it would be our salvation or our final doom. The world seemed to have stopped. The sound of the alarms, the frantic screams, all dissolved into a distant hum as I watched the syringe penetrate Sarah's arm. Her alien form shuddered, an inhuman scream escaping from her distorted throat. "Now we start the countdown," Professor Hawkins' voice cut through my clouded consciousness. "If it works, Sarah will become the epicenter of a wave that will reverse the transformation in all those affected and disable the alien technology." The words barely made sense to me. All I could see was Sarah, writhing in agony as her body fought against the transformation. Suddenly, the entire bunker shook. Outside, the first alien ships had broken through our atmosphere. "They're here!" someone shouted unnecessarily. Chaos ensued. Military personnel rushed to their positions. Scientists frantically monitored their instruments. I remained motionless, my eyes fixed on Sarah, silently praying to whatever God might be listening. That's when it happened. A pulse of energy emanated from Sarah's body, a wave of bluish light that expanded rapidly, passing through the walls of the bunker as if they were made of paper. "It's working!" shouted Professor Hawkins, his voice shaking with excitement. "The wave is spreading!" I ran to the main monitor, watching in amazement as the wave expanded across the globe. Points of light, representing the transformed, flashed and changed color as the cure reached them, but our victory was short-lived. "The alien ships!" shouted an officer. "They're falling!" Horrified, we watched the huge ships plummet from the sky, turning into fireballs as they entered the atmosphere. Cities already devastated by the first invasion now faced a rain of alien debris. "My God," I whispered. "What have we done?" Professor Hawkins put a hand on my shoulder, his face a mixture of triumph and regret. "We did what was necessary to survive." A high-pitched scream snapped me out of that moment of somber contemplation. "Sarah!" I ran back into the containment chamber, my heart threatening to leap out of my chest. Sarah was on the floor, her body convulsing violently. "Open the door!" I shouted, desperate. "We can't," replied one of the scientists. "The radiation is still too high." Powerless, I watched through the glass as the love of my life struggled between life and death, between humanity and monstrosity. The seconds dragged on like hours. Slowly, painfully, Sarah's body began to change again. The metallic skin dissolved. The empty black eyes gave way to the familiar irises I loved so much. When they finally opened the door, I threw myself inside, taking Sarah in my arms. "John," her voice was weak, almost a whisper. Tears streamed down my face. "I'm here, my love. You did it. You saved us all." A faint smile lit up her exhausted face. "We did it," she corrected, before slipping into unconsciousness. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Reports poured in from all over the world, confirming what we already knew. The alien invasion had been stopped. The transformed were returning to normal. But the cost? Cities in ruins, millions dead, a wounded planet, and a traumatized humanity. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Sarah recovered slowly, bearing visible and invisible scars from her ordeal. Together, we joined the rebuilding efforts. Professor Hawkins, hailed as the savior of humanity, led a global coalition dedicated to using the knowledge we had gained to rebuild our civilization. Alien technology, now inert, was studied and adapted. Slowly, painfully, we began to heal our wounded world. A year after what became known as the Day of Reversal, Sarah and I were standing on a hilltop, watching the reconstruction work in Millbrook. "Sometimes I wonder," Sarah said softly, "if we did the right thing." I looked at her, seeing the weight of guilt in her eyes. "We did the only thing we could do," I replied. "We survived. And now, we have the chance to build something better." She nodded slowly, her eyes turning to the horizon. "Do you think they'll come back someday?" I followed her gaze to the sky, now free of alien ships, but forever changed in our perception. "I don't know," I admitted, "but if they come back, we'll be ready." Sarah entwined her fingers in mine, a gesture of comfort and union. "Together," she said. "Together," I repeated. As the sun set over our transformed world, I reflected on everything we had been through, the terror, the loss, the sacrifice, but also the courage, determination, and triumph of the human spirit. We didn't know what the future held. The aliens could return. New challenges would certainly arise. But one thing was certain. Humanity had faced its toughest test and emerged stronger, more united. And as the stars began to dot the night sky, I knew that no matter what the cosmos had in store for us, we would face it together. As individuals, as couples, as a species. The dawn of a new era for humanity had arrived, and we were ready to face it, with hope in our hearts and determination in our souls.